Hashtag the most disturbing self-defense horror stories. Criminally ignorant number 5. In the quiet town of Maplewood, the locals prided themselves on the safety and tranquility of their community. Yet beneath this serene veneer, a dark undercurrent was about to unravel the lives of its unsuspecting residents. It began on a chilly autumn evening when Janet Miles, a 34-year-old librarian, was closing up for the night. As she sorted through the returns, a cold gust of wind blew through the doors, chilling her to the bone. Little did she know, this wind heralded a change that would disturb the peace of Maplewood forever. Janet lived alone in a quaint cottage just outside of town. The path from the library to her home wound through a densely wooded area known locally as Whispering Pines. It was a shortcut that Janet had taken countless times, but tonight, a palpable sense of dread filled the air. The trees seemed to lean closer, their shadows twisting into menacing shapes. As she hastened her steps, the crunching of leaves underfoot was suddenly accompanied by another set of footsteps eerily synchronized with her own. Heart pounding, Janet quickened her pace, but so did the footsteps behind her. Turning abruptly, she could just make out a figure cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. In a split second of decision, fueled by a primal instinct for survival, Janet reached into her bag and pulled out a can of pepper spray. As the figure lunged towards her, she unleashed a fiery stream towards her assailant. The figure howled in pain, stumbling back into the shadows, affording Janet enough time to make a desperate dash towards her home. Safe within her walls, Janet's relief was short-lived. The local news the next morning reported a series of similar incidents in Maplewood. The community was on edge, and the police were clueless about the identity of the attacker. The only clue was the increasing reports of a shadowy figure spotted lurking in Whispering Pines. Days turned into weeks, and Janet tried to return to normalcy. Yet, the trauma of that night lingered like a specter. Her solace came in the form of nightly checks of her security systems and the small canister of pepper spray that now never left her side. One foggy night, as Janet lay in bed, the silence was shattered by the shattering of glass downstairs. Her heart froze. Gripping the pepper spray, she tiptoed down the stairs, every creak a thunderous echo in the deathly quiet. The broken window pane in the living room moonlit the intruder's silhouette. It was the same figure from the woods. Frozen with fear yet driven by a fierce will to protect her sanctuary, Janet confronted the intruder. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded, voice trembling but resolute. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was disfigured, not by nature, but by injury. The eyes, however, shone with a clarity that was chilling. "You blinded me," he rasped, his voice a blend of pain and anger. "You took my sight in the woods. Now, I see nothing but darkness." Realization dawned on Janet. This was a case of mistaken identity, a tragic twist of fate where she had defended herself against someone who now sought vengeance for his unintended suffering. As the man advanced, blaming her for his perpetual night, Janet backed away, her mind racing for solutions. This confrontation wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a moral quandary. How could she defuse this situation without further violence? Could she even reason with someone so consumed by revenge? Janet's back hit the wall, there was nowhere left to run. The man's hands reached out, groping in the darkness he was condemned to, his fingers inches from her face. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the shallow breaths of two souls caught in a tragic dance of fate. As their eyes locked, a mutual recognition of humanity flickered between them. But before a word could be spoken, a sudden noise upstairs startled them both. Continued from previous segment, the noise from upstairs was abrupt, a clatter that echoed through the stillness of the house like a warning shot. Janet and the man both flinched, their standoff momentarily forgotten. The tension in the air shifted, as if the house itself was reacting to the intruder's presence. Janet seized the momentary distraction to edge towards the kitchen, her hands still clutching the pepper spray. The man, confused by the noise and still struggling with his blindness, paused to orient himself. His head turned towards the sound, giving Janet the split seconds she needed. She reached the kitchen and quickly pulled out a drawer, grabbing a flashlight. Turning it on, she shone the bright light directly at the man. "Stay back," she warned, her voice stronger now, empowered by the light in her hands. But rather than deterring him, the light seemed to enrage him further. "How dare you shine more light at me," he roared, his voice booming in the confined space of the house. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Janet. Light, the very essence of vision, now a weapon against someone lost in darkness. The man charged, more in desperation than aggression, his arms flailing. Janet dodged to the side, narrowly escaping his grasp. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever. She needed to escape, to get help, but every path was fraught with danger. As the chase ensued through her home, Janet's mind raced. Her sanctuary had turned into a labyrinthine trap, each room a potential corner to be caught in. She darted into the living room, the broken window reminding her of the house's vulnerability. She could run, but the woods were no safer at night, especially with a determined pursuer. Suddenly, a thought struck her. The attic! It was seldom used, cluttered and dusty, but it might offer a hiding place. Janet made a dash for the staircase leading to the upper floors, her breaths heavy, the sound of her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Reaching the attic door, she flung it open and scrambled up the old wooden ladder. The attic was dim, lit only by the moonlight straining through a small, grimy window. Boxes and old furniture cast eerie shadows, transforming the space into a scene from a horror film. Janet crawled behind an old dresser, her body trembling. She could hear the man's uneven steps as he searched the house below. His angry mutterings were punctuated by the occasional thump of something being overturned or thrown aside in frustration. The attic air was thick with dust, and Janet fought to keep her breathing quiet. She could feel the dust mites tickle in her throat, urging her to cough, but she suppressed it, knowing any sound could betray her hiding spot. Minutes stretched into what seemed like hours. The sounds from below lessened, then stopped. Had he given up? Or was he just waiting, as still and patient as she was, for any sign of movement? Janet's thoughts drifted to the man's words. "You blinded me," he had said. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the depth of his despair and rage. An accident, a moment of self-defense on her part, had spiraled into this nightmare scenario. Guilt gnawed at her, mixed with fear and a fierce desire to survive. She contemplated her options. Could she reach out to him, offer help, try to make amends? Or was the gap between them, widened by fear and misfortune, too great to bridge? The moral weight of the situation was crushing. As she wrestled with these thoughts, a soft creak echoed through the attic. Janet froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she peeked around the dresser. The attic door was inching open, a sliver of light from the hallway below cutting through the darkness. The man's heavy breathing was audible, a sinister soundtrack to his ascent into the attic. Janet clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, ready to defend herself, yet dreading the confrontation to come. Her mind raced with potential outcomes, each more horrifying than the last. The door creaked wider, the gap growing. Janet could see the outline of his head now, silhouetted against the faint light from below. He paused, as if sensing her presence. Their game of cat and mouse had reached its zenith, with both prey and predator pushed to their limits. And then, in the silent attic, another sound broke the stillness, a faint, distant siren. Police? Had a neighbor heard the disturbance and called for help? Hope surged through Janet, but with it, a new fear. What would the man do if he realized help was on the way? To be continued from previous segment, the distant wail of the siren grew steadily louder, piercing the eerie silence that had enveloped Janet's home. The man, hearing the sound too, hesitated at the threshold of the attic. His body tensed, as if preparing to make a crucial decision. Janet held her breath, her grip on the flashlight tightening. In the dim light, she could see his silhouette shift, turning slightly towards the source of the sound. With a sudden, desperate fury, the man lunged into the attic, his footsteps heavy on the old wooden floor. The space was cramped, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of long-forgotten memories stored in boxes and old furniture. Janet scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with panic. As the man advanced, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and anger, Janet's thoughts flew to the pepper spray she had left downstairs in her haste. She cursed silently at her oversight. Now, with only the flashlight as her defense, she felt vulnerable and terrified. The attic seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening into corners where any number of horrors might lurk. Janet's eyes darted around, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon or shield. Her hand brushed against a heavy, dusty book, a thick volume left forgotten on the floor. Without thinking, she grabbed it, holding it up defensively. The man was close now, too close. His breaths were ragged, his movements erratic as he struggled with his impaired vision. The light from the flashlight seemed to confuse him, his hands shielding his face as he moved blindly towards the sound of Janet's movements. "Why did you come back?" Janet's voice cracked as she spoke, the flashlight shaking in her hand. "The police are on their way. There's nothing left for you here." But the man's voice was a low growl, barely human. "You took everything from me. My sight, my life. I have nothing but darkness now." His words sent a chill down Janet's spine, but they also steeled her resolve. She couldn't let sympathy distract her from the threat he posed. As the man reached out, groping for her, Janet swung the heavy book with all her might. It struck him with a thud, causing him to stagger back, stunned. Janet didn't wait to see the effect of her blow. She darted past him, her only thought to escape the suffocating attic and get outside where the approaching sirens promised rescue. Her feet stumbled on the narrow ladder leading down, but fear propelled her forward. She reached the ground floor just as the front door burst open. 2 police officers entered, guns drawn, their faces set in expressions of alert concern. Janet nearly collapsed in relief, her body trembling uncontrollably now that help had arrived. "Upstairs!" "He's upstairs," she gasped, pointing towards the attic. The officers nodded, one moving to assist her while the other called for backup and began to ascend. As Janet leaned against the wall, her legs giving out beneath her, the reality of the night's events began to sink in. The sanctuary of her home had been violated, her sense of security shattered. She watched as the police officer disappeared into the attic, and a part of her wondered what would happen when he found the man. Would there be a violent confrontation, or had her blow subdued him enough for capture? Outside, the sound of additional sirens filled the air, a cacophony that signaled both an end and a beginning. As reinforcements arrived, Janet was led outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. She turned back to look at her house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. But the night was far from over. As Janet stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her mind teeming with questions and fears, a sudden shout came from inside the house. More officers rushed in, their radios crackling with urgency. Janet's heart sank. The situation was escalating again, the resolution slipping away into further chaos. As she strained to hear over the din of police activity, the earlier feeling of horror that had momentarily subsided surged back. Inside, the house groaned and creaked, as if lamenting its own role in the night's terror. And high above, in the attic, the struggle between light and dark, sight and blindness, continued, unseen, but deeply felt. Continued from previous segment, the chaos inside Janet's home escalated rapidly as more police arrived, responding to the desperate situation unfolding in the attic. The air was thick with tension, each officer moving with purposeful urgency, their voices a mixture of commands and updates crackling through their radios. Janet watched helplessly from outside, wrapped in a police blanket, each siren and shout slicing through the cold night air and deepening her sense of dread. She shivered not just from the cold, but from the unfolding terror within what was once her refuge. Inside, the lead officer cautiously ascended the attic stairs once more, flashlight piercing the darkness. The attic was silent now, eerily so. Boxes and shadows merged into an indistinct mass, making it difficult to discern where the man might be hiding. The officer moved slowly, his senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. As the officer approached the far corner of the attic, his flashlight beam fell upon a figure slumped against the wall. It was the man, seemingly unconscious, the side of his face bruised and swelling where the book had struck him. The officer radioed for assistance, his voice a whisper, not wanting to disturb the precarious calm. But as backup began to arrive, a low moan echoed through the attic. The man stirred, his injured face contorting with pain and confusion. His hand reached out, groping in the darkness, finding the officer's leg. The touch was weak, yet it sent a jolt of alarm through the officer, who instinctively stepped back. "Stay down! Help is on the way," the officer commanded, aiming his flashlight directly at the man's face, which was twisted in agony and rage. Below, Janet could only imagine the scene as she heard scattered reports from the exiting officers. Her heart raced, each beat a loud echo in her ears. The thought that the man was still capable of causing harm filled her with a relentless anxiety. Then, suddenly, there was a sharp, piercing scream, a cry that cut through all other sounds and silenced the murmuring crowd outside. It was a cry of utter despair and finality, chilling to its core. Officers rushed into the house, their movements now frantic. Janet stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror. The scream had not sounded like any of the officers. It was raw, filled with a primal fear that she knew all too well. Minutes later, the officers emerged, supporting the limp body of the man. He was alive but barely conscious, his face a mask of pain and defeat. As they loaded him into an ambulance, a senior officer approached Janet. "There was an accident," he explained grimly. "He tried to attack again, but lost his balance and fell. Hit his head pretty bad. He's going to the hospital, but it's serious." Janet nodded, her body numb. The relief of him being taken away was overshadowed by the horrific manner in which the night had unfolded. She turned to look at her house one last time, the broken window, the open door, the shadows lurking within. It no longer felt like home. As she prepared to leave, escorted by an officer, Janet's mind was haunted by the events. The man's despairing scream would echo in her nightmares, a stark reminder of the night when darkness invaded her life. But the story wasn't over. As Janet stepped into the police car, her eyes caught a flicker of movement from the upstairs window of her house. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow pass by, an impossible shadow, given that the house was now supposed to be empty. Chills ran down her spine as she realized that some horrors aren't easily escaped. Was it her imagination, or had something else been lurking in her home all along, stirred by the night's terror? As the car pulled away, Janet looked back at the house, its silhouette ominous against the night sky. The lingering uncertainty and fear that something remained in the house was overwhelming, setting the stage for a new chapter of horror in Maplewood.